Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 62 and 63. Let's begin. Today, Izuku, I'm going to teach you how to throw a punch, Kurogiri said softly. Izuku looked around the training room. There was a series of punching bags hanging from the high ceiling and there were targets on several of them. He noticed though as he looked around that there were several targets on concrete blocks. We will get to them, the Misty Man said when he noticed Izuku looking at them curiously. First off, please form a fist. Izuku did so and held up his hand for Kurogiri to look at. Curl your fingers in tighter, came the instruction. He did that. Kurogiri nodded. Now wrap your thumb over your fingers. There was really only one way to do that and Izuku quickly had a fist formed. Good, Kurogiri commented. Now, hit this, he instructed. This turned out to be a small ball that was about Izuku's shoulder height. He looked at it and noticed that it was on a stand that had a spring in it. Izuku threw a punch at it. His expression was shocked when he missed. He looked at Kurogiri, half accusingly. I did not shift at Izuku, the man read his expression. This will help you with targeting as well. I didn't realize there was so much, he said. Any fool can hit someone, Izuku, Kurogiri told him. And if you've gone that far, then you should do it properly. Try again. This time he managed to hit the target, but he could tell he'd only gotten the side of it. Again, Kurogiri instructed. He tried again. This time the hit was on target. It was an odd feeling. Izuku knew the target was softer than a person but he wasn't sure what he felt. The target stretched back and then sprung forwards returning to the original position. Good, Kurogiri praised. Now try a double punch. The Misty Man gestured with both hands, miming out a 1-2 punch. Izuku copied the motion. The first punch hit but his follow-up missed and he was smacked in the forearm by the target. Lift your arm. He tried again. He still missed the second one but the target didn't hit him as badly. Again. Izuku tried a third time. This time he felt himself hit the target with both hands. It definitely felt odd with his left hand. Good, Kurogiri said again. Izuku looked over at him with a small frown. I'm taking you through all the exercises, and then you can practice them, he explained as he moved to a new target. Next I want you to activate Kilo and punch this, Kurogiri instructed. Heavier. Please, he added. Izuku grinned and did as instructed. He hadn't used Kilo much, except to lighten himself when he flew, so he was happy to get the chance to practice making himself heavier. He made his fist heavier. To him, nothing felt different. Then he threw a punch at the target. It was drawn on a wooden backing board, so he expected some resistance. The complete lack of it surprised him and Izuku felt himself overbalanced. Kurogiri cried out. The green-haired boy heard it as he fell forward. The target flipped back with the base flicking out. It hit his legs and Izuku went down in a tangle of his own limbs on top of the target. Izuku. Ouch. I'm okay, Kurogiri, Izuku replied eventually. He hurt a bit but seemed okay otherwise. He rolled over on the target and then sat up, brushing himself off. What happened? It appears the targets will need to be a bit better affixed to the floor, the Misty Man told him. Izuku could detect relief as well as humor lacing his tone. He helped Izuku to stand. Let's try that again. On which target? This one, Kurogiri said, leading him over to a punching bag that was hanging from the ceiling. Though let me see your hand first. Dutifully Izuku held out his hands. Kurogiri took them and flipped them over so that he could see his knuckles. The Misty Man sighed. This will be the last punch, and then I will show you how to wrap your hands. Why do I need that? So that you don't break the skin, the warp gate replied. Now, again use Kilo and punch this bag. It should be soft enough that you won't get damaged. Izuku nodded and looked down at his knuckles. They were slightly red but nothing too bad. If I practice, will the skin become harder? It will, Kurogiri agreed. But wrapping is still best. Gigantomachia does not wrap his hands now, but he used to, he pointed out. Oh, Izuku said before he fell into a basic stance and formed a fist again. He focused Kilo on his hand and then threw it forward. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. Well, he'd been expecting to hit the target but beyond that, he wasn't sure. He was not expecting to end up with his fist lodged in the target. Izuku blinked. He looked at the punching bag. There was a depression all the way around his hand, but he'd definitely penetrated the outer leather. He could feel the sand grains on his skin. He pulled his arm back tentatively, but he couldn't pull his hand free. He couldn't even move his fingers. "Kurogiri?" Izuku called unnecessarily. "That was not expected," the man replied. He moved to hold the bag. "Try now," he said softly. Izuku braced himself and pulled back, but nothing changed. His hand was still stuck. "It does prove how effective using kilo is," Kurogiri said absently. "You don't have a strength enhancement quirk, Izuku, but you can mimic the effects if you are careful," he explained. The green-haired boy nodded. He'd already noticed that and was itching to write it all down. He wanted to practice more too. "When I hit something, it's just my body weight behind it," he analyzed. "But if I use kilo, while I am no stronger, the weight is more, so the effect is as if I was stronger." "Yes, now please hold still for a moment," Kurogiri said, and Izuku watched as the misty man waved one hand. A warp gate appeared under the punching bag. It was the diameter of the bag. He saw a flash of mist from the corner of one eye and saw that another gate had appeared over a barrel that was in the corner. Kurogiri moved the warp gate upwards and Izuku watched as the leather broke and the contents began draining out. It was quick and it felt odd. Almost as if Ochaco had used her quirk on him. There was a release of pressure and everything flowed down. "Just hold still," Kurogiri instructed. The bag quickly drained out, leaving Izuku with his hand through the outer casing and the soft padding. Kurogiri then grabbed the bag and held it steady and Izuku pulled back. He could feel the fabric scraping against his hand, but it was soft and he was quickly freed. He looked down at his hand. His knuckles were still red, but there were no cuts on it. That was something Kurogiri confirmed. "Now, let me show you how to wrap your hands," the misty man said. Izuku nodded and smiled. This had been a good lesson. He would have to experiment more with kilo. And tell his dad. It would be good to have something to talk to him about other than how his recovery was not progressing. Actually, if he combined kilo with Kali Imperium then... "Kurogiri," Izuku called. The misty man had gone to collect some wrappings. "Yes, Izuku? Could I try one more punch?" he asked. "It won't hurt my hand," he promised. "What do you wish to try?" "I want to try to combine kilo and Kali Imperium," Izuku explained. He could create barriers and pressure waves with Kali Imperium. The misty man thought for a few moments but then nodded. "Try against the wall," he indicated. From at least 6 feet, came the further stipulation. Izuku nodded and then moved. He stood for a few moments just studying the wall and thinking about what he needed to do. Then he focused Kali Imperium before him. Making an invisible box of nitrogen in front of him. He couldn't see it, but because it was his quirk he knew where it was. Then he channeled kilo into his hand as he formed a fist and drew his hand back. He lunged forward, putting all his strength into the punch. At the moment of impact, he released his mental hold on the nitrogen. He'd been keeping it in place but he let it go. He could still sense it though, and he felt the force of the punch push the gathered nitrogen towards the wall. It flashed over the distance and Izuku saw it hit. Actually, Kurogiri saw it as well with the way dust formed. But that was it. The wall didn't crack or have a gouge out of it. It had been hit but it wasn't very hard. "Very good, Izuku," Kurogiri praised. "Not really," Izuku replied. "I was hoping for something stronger. I can do that amount of force just by using Kali Imperium. You will have to practice and maybe ask Sensei if he believes you will be able to generate a suitable amount of force." The misty man added. Izuku nodded. His dad just knew these things. Though, he wondered if he could combine kilo with scale and make the projectile faster by releasing it with a punch. Maybe he could practice that next time. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome, Izuku. Now, let me show you how to wrap your hands," Kurogiri said, holding out a bandage. Izuku hurried over. There was always so much to learn. "Blue this week?" Ochaco chuckled as Izuku and Hitoshi walked into view. "Yep," he chirped happily. After they'd come back from winter break, Izuku had been changing his hair color every week. The teachers hadn't said anything but Ochaco knew they were annoyed by it. Izuku just looked at them in a way he never would have before his dad got injured. Her mother just said that it was probably one of the ways Izuku was coping. And really changing hair color wasn't something that was that problematic. "Good morning, Ochaco," Hitoshi greeted her. Good morning, Hitoshi, and of course, you little dragon. Ochaco greeted them before they all went inside. They were early today because she'd asked them to come early. She wanted to talk but they changed their shoes in silence, putting their outside shoes into the getabako. Then they walked to her classroom. Ochaco sat at her desk. Izuku and Hitoshi took seats facing her. So what did you want to talk about? Izuku asked curiously. There was no judgment in his question, but she knew he had been disappointed that she hadn't. It was hard to explain. I read that article, she said softly. The one about best jeanist? Hitoshi asked. Ochaco nodded. She swallowed. Did it? Did it really happen that way? Izuku's green eyes became sad as he looked at her. You watched the video as well? It had been difficult getting the time to watch it over the weekend with her parents around, but she had. It was a shaky video taken by someone who apparently witnessed the event. How does she sighed heavily? Why does it all get hidden? Izuku's expression changed to mirror his eyes and a tear actually traced its way down his face. Would you trust heroes if you knew? He asked instead of answering. Ochaco gasped and realized the truth. She wouldn't. She might be only 9, but she wouldn't trust them. Not the way she did. No. She didn't trust them now. I'm sorry, Ochaco, Izuku said gently. Is it all heroes? She asked, swallowing before she could start crying too. She wasn't exactly sure what she was crying for. She didn't see the way Izuku and Hitoshi shared a glance. Not really, Izuku said. It's hard to get stats on the underground heroes, since their activities aren't really recorded and they tend to fight one-to-one, not in hostage situations. Rescue heroes don't really cause damage either. Support heroes are okay too, though it depends on the situation. So it's the combat heroes? Ochaco felt better learning that. She wasn't sure why. Mostly, Izuku agreed. As I said, it depends on the situation with the others. She frowned. I get it, kind of, and they do need to be more careful, but if there were no combat heroes, who would deal with villains? Ochaco didn't know what type of response she was expecting, but she didn't expect Izuku to snort. Then he began chuckling. She looked to Hitoshi for an explanation. It's not every battle, he admitted. Also, some villains are bad, he told her, but a lot of them aren't. They are just pushed too hard or in a bad situation. I don't know how to deal with those who are truly bad though, but most villains would be better off dealt with by police. Ha! Izuku snorted. That's gonna have to wait, he said, jerking his head towards the clock. Just as he did it, the door slid open and Ochaco recognized Arata and Gatarui as they came in, chatting happily. Oh, Arata noticed them. You're here already. But she's with the sympathizer and the freak. Izuku sighed as Ochaco winced. Izuku was still labeled that, and since Hitoshi was his friend, he'd gotten that tag. He'd just laughed when he'd found out about it. I'll catch you later, Ochaco, Izuku said, running a hand through his blue hair as both he and Hitoshi rose. She nodded. I'll see you at lunch, she promised. They bobbed their heads in return and left quietly. Ochaco sat at her desk and looked down at the wood, not really seeing it. She didn't hear the soft murmurs between Arata and Gatarui as she thought. There was a lot to think about and she felt vaguely sick. Was the video Izuku had sent her, and the information he gave her, really how heroes were? Or was he focusing too much on the worst cases? She didn't know. And she wasn't sure how to find out. She didn't like that feeling. Giran. The man in question stared at his phone. It told him voice only, which wasn't the problem. The problem was that he recognized the voice. And he was scared stiff. It was Kurogiri's employer. He'd met the man once, and once was more than enough. Giran had heard of him, all for one. Juhan had told him, but meeting him was something different. He was terrifying just sitting there. There was an air of absolute surety about the man. As if he knew that no matter what you did he would be able to counter it easily. Now of course, Giran was aware of the rumors going around. How All Might had fought All for One, and how All for One had died. Except that obviously wasn't the case. There were other rumors going around though. All for One was injured. All for One had killed All Might and was going to kill the Prime Minister and rest of the government. Giran didn't believe that one. The underworld was the underworld after all, and they didn't do such stupid moves. There were a lot of rumors, and there had been a lot of politics going on though. A few months after the incident things were quietening down. He'd been a bit surprised when Kurogiri had called him but had fulfilled that order. Now he was terrified. Obviously, All for One had survived and all the politics that had gone on in the underworld were for nothing. Even if the man was injured, that didn't matter. Giran knew the man would be able to control everything. Those who didn't fall back into line would be dealt with. "Sir?" he said softly, trying to infuse respect into his voice. Dealing with Kurogiri, even knowing that the warp gate worked directly for this man was one thing, dealing with him directly, that was a whole different matter. Giran was terrified. But he was a broker, and even if he thought so for himself, a darn good one. He just needed to treat this man as a client. Find out what he wanted, and fulfill the contract. It was normal. He just had to keep reminding himself of that. "I have need of your services," All for One said. "What do you need, sir?" Giran asked. This man was just a client. This was the first step. Find out what he wanted. "I have need of a quirk." Giran felt his pink eyes widen. Of course he knew the whispers that All for One could take your quirk. That he could give you another quirk. But that's all they were, whispers, weren't they? It does not matter what the quirk is, but it should come from an older person. The key is that they must be completely willing to give it up, All for One continued. Giran swallowed as he tried to control his breathing. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't be true that All for One could take quirks. The individual must also be able to state that clearly, without ambiguity. It had to be true. What had Juhin gotten him into? Is this why she'd just grinned when he'd taken over the account with Kurogiri? It had seemed odd that she didn't fight him for the client, but he took it as some sort of graduation present. That he'd passed her test and become a broker in his own right. What a fool he'd been. "Can you provide that?" All for One asked pointedly. Despite the fear, or maybe because of it, Giran's mind was flying. He couldn't think about the quirk. All for One had said the quirk didn't matter. So what was the man asking for? He was asking for a geezer who was prepared to do something for money. That was much easier to think about. "What is your budget for this, sir?" Giran asked. "And how respectable do they need to be?" The answer to his first question would give a hint to the second, but he felt it best to have it stated opening. "Reasonably respectable," All for One answered immediately. All right, so he didn't want some homeless bum who would do anything for a few yen. That put the price up. "Price is negotiable, however, I will pay more for a serviceable quirk." "Understood," Giran heard himself say. He was still trembling and, if he was honest, he was more than a bit impressed by the way All for One treated this as just another transaction. No, that was foolish. For the man, it was just another transaction. An odd one, but just something he did every day. It probably was. This was why the guy ran the underworld. "I'll talk to a few people to see what can be found," Giran said. "Do that," All for One agreed, and Giran could hear the laughter in his voice. He knew the effect he had on Giran. Usually the broker would resent that. This time he just accepted it. "Let Kurogiri know when you found a candidate," came the further instruction, and the call was terminated. Giran was left staring at the now dark screen. He swallowed as he hyperventilated. Sure, he'd nearly been captured by heroes a couple of times, and those had been fearful experiences, but they had nothing on the phone call he'd just had. His consciousness now relegated those experiences to mere carnival fears, liking walking through the House of Horrors. You knew nothing would hurt you, but you were still scared. Talking to All for One was nothing like that. Giran closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe deeply. This was just another job. That's all he had to focus on. Just another job. There were few things in life that surprised Kyudai Garaki. Sometimes an experiment actually surprised him, but usually that was with the new knowledge it revealed. It was a nice surprise, but not the type he was experiencing now. With the past few months being so busy, he hadn't had a chance to keep up with his reading. And that's why he was surprised. One of his papers, written under an alias, had been published. An examination of quirk factor in the quirkless, why the middle to distal little toe joint is not enough to determine status. He remembered that paper. He'd written it to point out that many of the people who had the extra toe joint also had a detectable quirk factor, which completely invalidated the theory they were quirkless. After all, you couldn't have a quirk factor if you didn't have a quirk. The thing was, other scientists had confirmed his theory, or at least his findings. He had presented his findings in this paper, and had only outlined the theory that if a so-called quirkless person indeed had a quirk, then they had to work on both diagnosis techniques and theories. He'd mentioned his old theory of quirk singularity as well as the one suggesting that the so-called quirkless were indeed quirk stabilizers. The paper had been designed to provoke thought, and to have people confirm his findings, not to present the hypothesis he knew was right. He had a paper written for that, but hadn't put it forth yet for publishing. There were responses berating him with heretical strength, but there were some responses which were supportive. They expressed genuine surprise when they confirmed his findings, though they still expressed doubt in his theories. Garaki sighed. He wondered if it was too late to reply to some of them? He'd missed all of this because all for one's condition had taken precedence. It couldn't hurt, he decided. And, maybe it was time to publish another paper, one that took his findings further, and fleshed out the quirk stabilization theory that went hand in hand with quirk singularity. With all the work he'd done with quirkless experiments, he now knew several bloodlines that demonstrated stability. He smiled as he pulled up one of the responses and logged into the account he'd made. This was a good opportunity. Izuku looked over at Tomura as the teen entered the room. He'd finished his homework and was writing in his quirk notebook. It was the one he kept about his quirks. He had been able to combine kilo and scale, but the projected scale hadn't gone very far. At least, not at first. He'd only managed to get a bit of practice in, but already the scale was traveling further and faster. Kurogiri had stopped him when the practice board was full. But it was an exciting possibility. So, you haven't asked me for any stats lately, Tomura said, glaring out from between the fingers of the hand that was affixed to his face. There was another hand gripping each of his arms. The insinuation was clear. Tomura was sure his friends had told him to bugger off. Izuku shook his head. Hitoshi is cool. It made Izuku feel good to know that Hitoshi had read the information he'd gotten from Tomura and Kurogiri and had accepted it. Hitoshi had a realistic view though. He openly admitted that it wasn't all heroes, and it wasn't every mission that they went on. There were some heroes, even combat ones, who did everything the way a hero should. Hitoshi didn't have a bias towards the daytime combat heroes, as his favorite heroes were the underground ones and no one could give him much information on them. And what of your little girlfriend? That was a harder question to answer. Ochaco read the information and she'd checked it, but she didn't want to believe it. Izuku had been annoyed at that until his dad reminded him of what a change it was for her. She didn't have his experience. She didn't know the things he did. He had to be patient with her. And he was being patient. He hadn't sent her any more information so that she could think about the cases she already knew about. Tomura snorted. She's still a little NPC, he taunted. She just needs time, Izuku countered. PFT. Better break it off with her now, the teen countered. She's going to be a liability to you. Izuku rolled his eyes. Like you'd be any better, he said. What? Tomura growled. Izuku fixed the teen with a stare. They'd been doing well lately, since Dad had been hurt, but Tomura just kept pushing and pushing. If Dad hadn't taken you in, you'd just be another NPC. As soon as he'd delivered the line, Izuku realized he'd gone too far. But he wasn't taking it back. Because it was the truth. Izuku could see the way Tomura's eyes widened, his pupils becoming pinpricks, allowing the red of his iris to dominate. The teen actually trembled. And then he screamed and lunged forward. Hands outstretched. The green-haired boy's first instinct was to just grab Tomura's quirk, but he'd done that enough and he figured Tomura would simply move to punch him. Instead, he pushed the teen, forming a wall of atmospheric nitrogen to drive him back. Izuku slid out of his chair and stood with his fists clenched at his sides. She's not an NPC, he said fiercely. Tomura stumbled backwards, but he was quick to recover. And with a yell he jumped again at Izuku. Hands still outstretched. You take that back. No. Izuku growled and pushed him back again. This time he didn't release the pressure. Barriers were almost the first thing he'd learned to create with Kali Imperium. He pushed Tomura back up to the wall and then focused, pushing his hands in beside him. The teen was making grabbing motions. You can't disintegrate air, Tomura, Izuku reminded him, stepping close but not so close that if Tomura managed to get free that he'd be in range of the teen's reach. She's not an NPC, Izuku repeated. You take it back. Tomura snarled. It sounded like spit would have come from him, but the hand covering his face kept Izuku from knowing that. Don't call her a NPC, Izuku said. And I won't call you one, he offered the deal. Tomura growled but didn't give him a response. Okay, stay there for a while, he said, turning away. It would be a good test for him to see how long he could hold Tomura there while writing in his notebook. Izuku sat back at his desk and picked up his pen. Bastard! Tomura yelled. Izuku ignored him as he reread the last sentence he'd written. Perhaps he could project his scales better if he also used Kali Imperium with it. He could pull all the nitrogen in the air out of the way, but that left the oxygen and other gases, which would still be less dense than normal air. Or maybe he could make a tube out of nitrogen and make a vacuum? They'd done an experiment in class about vacuums and it showed how a train could work. It wasn't exactly correct, but the principle was there. He wrote the idea down in the list of things he had to try. As he tried each of the ideas, he wrote them properly into his journal with an explanation of what it was, what he had been trying to achieve and what the outcome was. Not everything worked, but it was good to experiment. And even failed experiments lead to new ideas. He thought about the new quirks he'd gotten from his dad. Poison Fang and Nightcat. Being able to see in the dark was brilliant. He hadn't had a chance to use Poison Fang, but he knew it would come in handy in the future. Bastard! Tomura screamed. Izuku winced. He'd forgotten how noisy Tomura could be. He looked over. Don't call her a NPC, he said, deliberately softly. Tomura snarled and twisted against the barrier. Izuku watched as he put his hands on the wall. It immediately started turning to dust, exposing the inner construction. He wasn't sure if the wall was structural or not. So Izuku released the barrier, and actually pulled Tomura away. They glared at each other for a few moments. Izuku raised one hand. There was nothing visual when he used Kali Imperium, but he knew Tomura recognized the gesture. PFT. Nothing ever changes with you, the teen snarled and then stalked away. Izuku watched him go, listening for his footsteps as he retreated. It was only when he was sure Tomura was gone that he sighed. Maybe he had gone too far, but... No. If Tomura didn't respect his friends, then why should he respect Tomura? Ochaco was doing her best. She was trying to see the bigger picture, but she had nothing to relate it to. Hitoshi knew that the world wasn't nice. Naoki and Shigeru had warned him against talking to Hitoshi, but at the same time they knew what Setsuna was like and they knew she was training to be a hero. They saw the bad bits of the system, but Izuku didn't think they'd actually go against the system. Hitoshi would. Ochaco was like Naoki and Shigeru that way. She was a part of the system. She was accepted. She had no reason to see the bad parts because they didn't impact her. Except now they had, through him. She was trying and Izuku was thankful for that. And because she was trying, Tomura did not get to call her a NPC. He could call Naoki and Shigeru NPCs but not Ochaco. Not when he'd have been an NPC as well, or maybe he'd have been like Hitoshi. Able to see the faults but not sure what to do about them? Either way, he didn't get to say she was an NPC. Izuku looked at his wall and sighed. He still wasn't sure if it was a structural wall but thought it probably wasn't. It didn't seem solid enough. The plaster was gone, revealing wooden uprights and some crosspieces. The PowerPoint was hanging by the cabling and looked rather sad. Izuku sighed again. He was going to have to at least sweep up the dust. And then tell Kurogiri because he already knew Tomura wouldn't bother. He shook his head. This was going to be annoying. End chapters 62 and 63, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.